Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and good morning for those of you on the West Coast. We are going to be talking today in the February webinar about setting attainable decarbonization goals. This is a hot topic right now. There's a lot of changes. We'll cover some of those, but we're also going to talk about setting decarbonization goals is not something organizations have done much of. And so we want to take you through an interesting framework that Danny actually came up with for one of our clients that we think will be valuable to you all today. So we're just going to give it one more moment for everyone to join the webinar here. But again, big picture, we were really impressed, Danny, with the model that you built for our client, and we wanted to share it out with everybody here. So you may watch this webinar and say, hey, this is something I want to engage Foresight on. We'd love to connect with you. You may see this webinar and say, hey, this is something we want to build internally. That's great as well. But certainly this is a model that we think is really compelling. All right, we're going to jump right in. So my name's Mike Troupis. I'm a vice president here at Foresight Management and been with the firm for 13 years. I host a lot of these webinars, and I'm excited for you to join us today. Danny, could you give them an introduction?
Yeah, I'm Danny McGee. I'm also on a lot of these webinars with Mike. So I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Yeah, I suppose I should give the usual disclaimer. You got two engineers here, so if it gets off the rails, we're sorry.
Yeah.
A lot of new faces and a lot of familiar faces to the webinar, but we wanted to just take a quick moment and help you understand who Foresight is and why we have expertise around this topic. So big picture, you can think of Foresight as your outsourced sustainability and energy manager. So we are predominantly focused on helping middle market industrial manufacturing companies not only come up with an energy and sustainability plan, but also implement it, track their progress, and then report successfully. So we have a number of different services, a number of different practices that roll up within our 100-person organization. But again, big picture, we find most organizations that do under $2 billion in revenue don't have on staff people dedicated to this. And so we're finding a lot of success in helping them on their journey at less cost than a full-time equivalent person. And then, like I mentioned on the next slide, we are narrowly focused on industrial manufacturing. Maybe something I'll say, because I say it a lot, is America's making a lot of investments in manufacturing right now. It's a really exciting time to be building things here in the US. We also find this market, for some reason, is really underserved. There's a lot of energy and sustainability firms out there that care a lot about commercial buildings or residential, but not enough focused on industrial manufacturing. So we just want to say, we really care about making manufacturing sustainable and competitive here in the US and beyond. All right, so let's jump in, Danny, to the topic at hand today. Like I mentioned kind of at the top of this, setting a decarbonization goal is kind of an abstract thing that companies don't have necessarily a ton of experience in doing. Just help me understand, like, why are companies setting decarbonization goals?
Yeah, and I think, like, I'll even just say why do companies set goals in general?
Sure.
Right? Ultimately they sell a product. What does it matter if they have a goal 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now?
Yeah.
And usually the reason they're setting any type of goal is to communicate some sort of vision or strategy to their stakeholders, right? And so we see that, in general accounting principles, right? Like you in your filings or you're saying, we are going to try to be this profitable this year. We're going to try to sell this much, right? These are goals that kind of communicate. And this is how we'll know when we're successful, right?
Yeah.
Decarbonization goals are aligned with that, right? As we have expanded who cares around this stuff, right? We've talked a lot about, shareholder to stakeholder, right? So now companies are serving not just a small, subset of their larger stakeholders. They're answering to a larger, customer base, government bodies, investors, right?
Yeah.
And as they expand who they're answering to, they are also need to speak about more things, and right. And one of the things that's that they're being asked about is like, what's your strategy as it relates to carbon or maybe climate change or those things, right? And they might be asked from a regulatory standpoint. We saw, CSRD has big news coming out today, right? And we have California has regulation around reporting on these things, and I think generally customers are asking a lot more around what what is in the products that they're buying, right? So that to me is like the driver on a lot of these, and the why behind it.
That's a really good point, and it's good that you highlight so many different stakeholders are asking about this. We've also found over time, sustainability's changed a lot in the last 5 years, and it seems like different stakeholders
Right.
have asked at different times. And I would agree with you. It seems like right now the biggest stakeholder seems to be regulatory. Certainly, to your point, consumers are still asking. The supply chain, so the top of the supply chain customers are asking, but it seems like regulatory is just like it's unfolding kind of rapidly right now.
Yeah, and I think also it's a market differentiator, right?
Yeah.
Like it helps companies say like, at this moment in time, maybe we look the same as our competitors, but we actually have a different vision, right? And this is how we know and can walk, or this is how you know that we're going in that direction because we're going to hit these goals along the way.
Sure. And speaking of the marketplace, Danny, just help me understand if you think about like what's changing or where is the marketplace moving when it comes to setting decarbonization goals?
Yeah. So I actually joined Foresight. We were working for a small consulting company before that, and we joined forces in 2020.
Yeah.
And that was like that was really the heart of decarbonization goals, right? We had something like 10,000 companies sign up for SBTI in the first 3 years of 2020 to 23, right?
Yeah.
And I think just by the nature of the number of companies that are left that haven't done those, like that acceleration has slowed down, right? Not as many companies are setting those goals, but also like and a lot of like big energy companies especially energy companies have pulled back those goals or pushed them out. Pushed them out meaning
farther into the future.
Farther into the future. But ultimately, I think what it speaks to is like at this moment in time, so 5 years after this kind of big onrush, is companies are just becoming a little bit more nuanced in how they're approaching this, right?
Yeah.
This is no longer a vision setting exercise. This is a tactical strategy for how you are going to be a differentiator and answer questions to your stakeholders, right? And so the kind of the large vision that we were seeing in 2020, it just isn't as it's applicable, but it isn't really what's needed at this moment. What we need is a little bit more nuance and understanding of like, okay, great, everybody says they're going to do that, but how are you specifically going to set attainable goals, right? And that's kind of like why we're here, right?
Yeah, so well said. It feels like kind of like growing up, right? You're in your angsty teenager years and you have these like crazy visions for your life, and then you hit your 20s and you got to like find a job and get rolling. And so it feels like, back then, sustainability was really nascent and those big picture sustainability goals were popular. And now it's like, all right, guys, we're a little bit more of a mature industry. There's real frameworks out there that are available. And so let's figure out, how we can utilize those and work with them. Okay. So why, we covered this a little bit, but maybe we should go into a bit of nuance here, is why do companies set goals?
Yeah, and we kind of talk about it, but ultimately, I think we've done a webinar with Kevin from People Design, right? And People Design has their marketing and branding company and strategy and a bunch of other things. I'm going to sell them short, so I immediately was like, I can't say everything that they are, so sorry. But they have a framework around say and do, which is your actions and how you talk about those actions kind of play with each other, right? Sometimes you're saying things differently so that you can do things differently, and sometimes you're doing different things so you can speak about them differently. And I think the way I think about it is like there's a narrative that you have as a company about who you are, what your vision is, what your strategy is, and goals are the do, right? They are how do we know what you said about who you are, what your narrative is? How do we know that's true? Like what are the kind of very specific marks in the sand that that we can point to and say like whether you're living up to your own aspirations? And we see this. It's like we're talking about decarbonization, but companies have been doing this for forever, right? Like speaking about what their profitability is going to be, and we see reports and say, this company missed their goals for this quarter and their revenue, right?
Yeah.
Those are because they had a narrative of what the market was going to do, what their customers wanted, how they were going to invest in that, and then they calculated and said, "Oh, I think we're going to be this profitable," right? And sometimes you miss the mark, but that to me is like what the purpose of a goal would be.
Yeah, I'm gonna like butcher this quote, but it sounds like you're talking about like the thing where it's like you got to lay plans, but you almost never follow those plans. But the art of setting, like I want to go this direction and I'm going to move towards that way. I may end up taking a very circuitous route to get there, but ultimately, like I'm trying to go somewhere. We're trying to move somewhere. We're trying to do something. And if you don't set that line in the sand, it's kind of hard to make progress at all.
Yeah, I don't think that was the quote, but I love that way.
It's something. It's some general from, I don't know, history.
I agree, spot on.
All right, so let's move on here. Let's start. Where do you start when it comes to decarbonization goal setting?
I think so. We have on the slide, understand where you are, understand where you want to go, and create congruent goals to get you there. And this feels very simple, right?
Yeah.
I kind of think that fundamentally, one of the hardest parts is understanding where you are today, because what we're trying to do is you can set goals to go super deep within, right? We work with a number of furniture manufacturers, and furniture manufacturing has plastics and steel and textiles and aluminum, like a full spectrum of materials, right? Yeah. I could set goals as it relates to the carbon intensity of any one of those materials, right? I could get really, down in the details. And companies do that, and they do that internally and they do that externally, right?
Sure.
And you see that automotive, right? Like similar. Yeah. But is that the best? Is that where, right? Where it matters where you start, right? Sure. If you're still, lagging in a lot of, and we'll get into this with the maturity model, if you're still lagging in other aspects of your business, it doesn't really matter that you have found this perfect material, because the rest of your company is still figuring out, which way is up. And so I think
balance. You got to be more broad. Right? Yeah. So it's tempting to go deep in certain areas instead of saying I'm going to holistically try to address sustainability and decarbonization.
Yeah. So I think we'll talk about as plotting where you are, but specifically, and this gets to it, is plotting where you are in accordance with these kind of three pillars.
So let's talk about this. Before I do, I will say, I mentioned this at the top of the hour here, we helped create this for a client who hired us to do decarbonization. And we found this framework, they found this framework, and we found this framework to be extremely helpful in looking holistically at setting goals. And I'll actually use a real life example for me, and then Danny, I'll let you talk here about this, as you're the subject matter expert. But this framework made a whole lot of sense for a real life example that happened in my life, which is I'm pretty clean, but I hate cleaning. So I bought a robot vacuum. And being a sustainability nerd that I am, I said, hey, there's 3 or 4 major brands, and all of them have sustainability reports. So I'm going to go read them and check it out and see who seems to be doing a really nice job when it comes to sustainability. And so I picked a brand that had some really strong scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas reduction targets and progress, and then also just had a nice sustainability report. Bought their vacuum, and then was pretty frustrated when 3 months after the warranty ran out, it broke. And then I was like, I'm an engineer, I'm trying to be handy. YouTube is great. You go try to figure out what was wrong with it, and I'm trying to fix it, and there's no aftermarket parts. You're not really supposed to repair it. If you call vacuum repair places, they're like, yeah, the manufacturer of these robots basically don't want you to repair them. And so you're sitting in this spot where it's like, okay, cool, you have all of these, in this case, really great operations targets in a sustainability report that talks a lot about them, but frankly, your product's kind of junk. And that was really frustrating. This was a big wake-up call for me of I think back to discussing 2020 when sustainability was hot. I think in 2020, decarbonization was almost exclusively discussing your operations. What are you going to do about your scope 1 and your scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, and how are you going to reduce them? And I think with this framework, there's a lot more broad look at holistically your organization, your product, how you govern. How are you going to build decarbonization into all of those components? So with that story in mind, to help you understand, there's a lot more to decarbonization than just your operations. Danny, do you have anything more to add to this before we jump into like the full
Yeah.
visualization?
Yeah, I think we do a lot of work around life cycle analysis and then also life cycle thinking, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And Mike, you and I have had a lot of conversations around this. Life cycle analysis is something that you apply to a product, right?
For
And
sure.
it's understanding the environmental impacts of your product. You can use that same framework and that same type of analysis to understand the environmental impacts of your company.
Sure.
And the value to a company to doing life cycle thinking and incorporating it across it is, companies, as you just described, are judged by their products, but also the products are judged by the companies that make them, right? Like we, as consumers, want good products made by good companies, right? And a really great product that we love, made with slave labor, is gonna be seen as like incongruent and less than, right? Not sustainable, or not the benefit to like the social benefit of that is negative. And so I think the idea behind this is that the interplay of like how products and organizations kind of work together is helps us understand like where to put our resources, right?
Sure.
You can be super sustainable in your product. You can also be super sustainable in your operations. The only way you're actually going to be sustainable in both is having sustainable governance.
Yes.
Right. And so that's kind of the third pillar on that.
Governance is like the framework that drives the other two down through the organization. Yeah. And it's a three-legged stool. Certainly you need all three, and you kind of need them to all be the same maturity, or else you don't really have a nice stool to sit on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this is good enough talking. Let's get into this visualization. So we use this with the client. I think this is going to be the framework and visualization we're going to use. And certainly, again, if you want to build this in-house, this is what we're going to be spending the bulk of our time here today discussing. So first things first, Danny, you can see there's the governance, operations, and products, the three different legs of the stool that we talked about up and down. And then across you have obligatory, efficient, competitive, leading, and regenerative. Do you want to just take a minute and help us understand, like, how does, like, big picture, how should an organization think about how this all works?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the webinar with People Design, we talked about opportunity versus what you're complied to do, obligatory, right? And so I think we can kind of think of it in the same mindset. On the left side of this is what you have to do, right?
Yeah.
Anything lower than that, you are out of spec.
And you'll find almost every organization that hasn't started lives here.
Right. Well, or that's what they're most focused on, right? Because regulation and maybe at this moment in time, a lot of our regulation is being stalling or being kind of pulled back. But like if you look over the course of the last 20, 30 years, sustainability has really just only had one mega trend, right? It's like we're becoming more mature and more advanced in this, and so the obligatory piece has been moving up. But that's typically a lot of companies are focused on that line, right? What making sure they're in compliance, which they should be, right? On the other side of this, you have certifications like Living Building and Living Product that have really set a vision for what is possible for companies and products to be, right? Cool. And that the word regenerative, I wouldn't say that this is like, oh, we're all living in here, right? I think this is aspirational, this is visionary, this is what we, the upward ends of this is a net, not just a sustainable, right? Because there's another graph round of like sustainable is essentially limiting your negative impact, right? Regenerative is positive impact, like, and that is across the full spectrum of carbon and social and biodiversity and acidification and kind of all these different pieces. So I think and then the efficient, competitive, leading, we'll get into this as we go through each one of those, but they kind of slice this down a little bit, and what's nice about this is it applies. You can take the same principles for what an efficient company looks like in governance, operation, and products. And ultimately, what we're offering here, and Mike, your story about the robot vacuum is perfect, is like your product, well, in that instance, let's say your operations might be leading or competitive, but if your product is just barely meeting basic safety requirements, you're being judged by your lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
And so like this is a webinar about goals, right? Why are you spending more time setting a broad and aggressive vision in your operations if ultimately you're being judged by your lowest common denominator? Set some goals, and they don't have to be, regenerative. Maybe they just have to optimize for better energy and waste.
Yes, like we talked about, kind of ideally you want all three to be in the similar bucket and move in tandem. And again, generally speaking, you're going to find governance is going to lead. It's going to be the way to set the process in place for the rest of them. So what we're going to do is, this is perfect. We're going to jump into each of the three different topics and kind of talk about what all is entailed within how you can progress around your maturity, what kind of things you can put in place. I will say, and I'll talk about these as we go along, we have other webinars if you want to dig deep into this, right? We have an hour to cover a lot of information here. So we're not going to be talking about how to build out a robust governance or operations or product strategy here in the webinar today. We do have other webinars that will touch on those, and I'll talk about them when we get there. And then once we've gone into these details, then we can start to apply, how do you take this framework and apply it to yourself and your stakeholders? So Danny, talk to me a little bit about governance. How does it work, and what can organizations do to make progress on it?
Yeah, I mean, so what we have on the screen, we were trying to we were batting around different graphics for this, right? And where we landed was, let's just throw up some examples, because governance ultimately is a little hard to conceptualize, right? What does that actually mean, and how does that show up?
Yeah, we're not just talking about like the government. This is like, how do you govern your organization?
And how do you know when you've done it well and when you're not doing it well, right? It's one thing to say like, we're good at governing, right? But what does that actually look like?
Governance doesn't always just mean more policies. To your point, it means empowering and implementation too. So
so on the left side, we have efficient, right? And that's typically obligatory. That's typically like decentralized. We work with a lot of multi-site manufacturers, right? And they have sites all over different, all over the globe.
Yeah.
And they have local laws and regulations that all those different sites have to manage. And a lot of times, they'll outsource that to those sites and just be like, it is your job to not break the law, right?
Oh yeah.
And that's kind of like just being in compliance, right? I think the step above that is, we talk about a consolidated approach, which is taking, this is in the efficient, and then would be a consolidated approach, is to maybe set some goals, like to have some kind of, this is where we start maybe talking about management systems. I think probably the next step over where we're in the competitive space is management systems, right? So if we have decentralized, then we have consolidated, meaning there might be a level of hierarchy to this decentralized approach, right? This is I always go to the way grids operate, right? Like right now we have big power plants that just like push out energy. Well, imagine a governance structure that just kind of pushes out policy and says you need to meet these types
with all the cyber pain. This is what organizations have done from an IT standpoint, right? They just take that at the top, they consolidate it all, and they say, we're implementing all these safeguards across all our plants. And that's a great example of like a consolidated approach to IT.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. But here's the problem with that, right? Is like in that approach, there are opportunities and unique pieces that exist within each one of these facilities, right? And so if you just have this kind of top-down, push out the policy type of approach, you're missing that, right? And you're actually, maybe you're efficient because you're not wasting kind of the different nuances, but you're missing some of these opportunities. So then we talk about, excuse me, coordinated approach.
Well, and coordinated, again, back to, I'll keep the example going. So when you get to like coordinated and empowered, you're going back to the IT example. Like we've seen this now where IT has swung too far, right? They centralized, they said, we can't get hacked. And so now like you can't share any information across your organization or with other organizations. And so IT, like in some regard, hasn't taken the time to say, well, what do we actually need to be able to still continue to do our business efficiently and not get hacked?
Yeah. And I think like, the coordinated piece you see, like ISO 14001 is a good example. And we do, we help companies implement this, right? And in a good ISO program, the people at each one of these facilities are in clear communication with what's happening at the facilities and what the goals are of management, right? And so again, we're getting back to like, how does this tie to goals, right? It is very hard in an obligatory standpoint to set corporate goals if every company is doing their own thing.
100%.
Maybe it's a little easier if you're just like pushing out, hey, you got to meet this percentage, right? But not every, we have, multi-site manufacturers that have like huge opportunities in one plant and very little opportunities. And maybe this is a warehouse, right? And we say everybody needs to meet a 20% reduction in energy use. Like there's not
much energy in the building.
Right. There's lighting and then we're done, right? And so the coordinated piece says, oh, what's unique to you? Let's be in communication. Let's be in regular contact about this stuff, and then take a little bit more nuanced approach. We move from there, and we're getting into like really what's an empowered look like for governance, right? And so we're getting closer to a regenerative space. And I think of like, again, the power systems, right? We are literally moving from we've gone through this with the grid, right? Everybody, way back when was producing their own little, maybe had a windmill on their site. Got a story for that, right? Like, and then they join a co-op. Now we have these large power systems that are just pushing out power. But now we actually have a distributed and coordinated power system, and we're moving to an empowered one, right? We actually have on-site communication and
active curtailment, and you can change and move depending on what the needs are.
Right. And so imagine that from a site level, like that I can make at an individual site decisions that are not just in alignment with the values, but are actually pushing the goals that the management wants and saying like, hey, here's where we need to be going, right? That's empowered. You get to the regenerative piece of this. Now we are all unified and work. There's no kind of like back and forth, right? And this is kind of like utopia, like, governance is messy, but we have a little thing about like how beehives operate and everybody knows their place and we don't communicate. When I used to do trail work, the vision was like, when you're swinging the axe, the person was like sharpening it on the upswing and you were like coming down. Like that's right, regenerative, right? And your sites are working so in such like sync with the rest of the organization that there isn't the inefficiencies around that communication piece.
Well, I want to allow plenty of time for us to get to the next two topics. So this is the governance. There's a lot of different ways within governance that you can build out these systems and have the vision that Danny talked about and making your way down. And again, like we said, this is what you want to prioritize first. So if we go back to our graphic, the next thing that we're going to cover is operations. And so how do we make our operations mature from a sustainability standpoint? Again, I always want to like maybe define operations here for a moment. It's not a perfect example, but I would argue a lot of your operations are going to look like your scope 1 and your scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, where your product, this isn't perfect, but a lot of your product is going to be your scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Governance is going to include some scope 3 with like supply chain, but generally speaking, when we talk operations, we're talking about the factories in which you're producing the goods, the logistics in which you're using to get the goods, the raw materials to your factory, and the finished goods from your factory to your consumer. And so, Danny, let's talk about decarbonizing your operations. What are some levers and tools and approaches from a maturity standpoint that you can do there?
Yeah, and I think like your point here, we often really push companies to think about, all of the inputs that are done to the materials and to the components and to the parts that make up the final product.
Yeah.
And this gets back to that, what does the customer care about, right? I spend a lot of time thinking about this. I ultimately do not care what your boundary is. I care about the product that I buy from you.
That's exactly right.
You can wax poetic about how this is inside and outside of your control and have excuses or not have excuses, right? But like ultimately, I want to know that the materials that were mined or grown went from that point to my like possession in a sustainable manner.
That's right.
And so I think about we have like scope 1 and 2 and 3, and I think it's a good framework scope 1, 2, and 3 are good frameworks to describe the level of control that you have, right? And
Yes.
they also can be used to describe the level of risk that you have in different
Absolutely.
spaces. But ultimately, what they don't describe is like whether or not the customer cares. And so
Well said.
when we think about setting goals under operations, like obviously how we set the goals and what we set around those goals matter as if they're scope 1, 2, or 3, right?
Sure.
So I can't say, oh, I'm going to reduce all of my scope 3s by 30% and not talk to my supply chain about how we're going to do that, right?
Does not work.
There needs to be an understanding and an agreement in place, right? And so what I might be able to do, and you see SBTI has done this, is say like, well, I'm going to really require that all of my customers, or sorry, my supply chain meet certain goals in order for them to be suppliers of us, and right? And so then that's going to guarantee. I can't. They can decide not to do that and they can go elsewhere. But like this is part of our business strategy and our kind of market differentiation, right?
Cool.
And so we're starting on the left here, and we're looking at compliance focus. That feels pretty, straightforward.
Yeah.
And I think honestly, we don't even need to spend too much time on the operations standpoint because this is the one I think most people are so familiar with.
Where people started, right? When you talk decarbonization 5 years ago, they would have completely ignored governance and probably products and just been focused on
right. And I think, and they would have just avoided scope 3. They said like, we're going to focus on our operations, our scope 1 and 2, and just the facilities that we have control over, and then we did it. Yep. And ultimately, I don't think the companies to care, customers care that much. Yeah. And I think what's interesting in this space really is essentially moving from efficient to leading is the integration of products, right?
Okay. Because
if you are this goes back, like we care about the final product and what is being made. If I never consider the kind of processes that are needed in order to transform that product into the final product.
Okay.
And I don't consider the materials that the interplay of those two, right? I would tell the facility managers, make your equipment as efficient as possible, right? And you'd never like revisit why do we have that equipment in the first place, right? The example I think I've used in other webinars. So if you were to say, make your house as efficient as possible.
Sure.
And you never revisited how you're heating your house, you would just focus on making the furnace as efficient as possible, right?
We're adding more insulation.
Well, you might not, right? Just make the furnace 99.9%.
Yeah.
And you could add more insulation. At some point, when you add so much insulation and so much air sealing, you actually don't need that furnace anymore. And that's called a passive house, right? And so they have their own standard and all the things, right? And a passive house means that like we've rethought essentially how we're going to heat this house. Well, moving from efficient to leading is rethinking how you're meeting your customer demand with a different type of product that requires different type of operations, right? And so, maybe an easy one on the automotive piece is like green steel, right?
Yep.
I think I saw somewhere it's like, steel actually isn't the main whatever it is there, if there's a 30% increase in the cost of green steel, it's a 1% increase in the cost of the car.
Because it's such a small component of the cost.
Right. And that changes
a huge piece of the carbon.
Fundamentally changes the carbon footprint of that car, right? Yep. And so, if you're making disposable products that aren't
made for the long term, can't be repaired, etc.
When you make more durable products, and that is this is again like now you're making literally a different product.
Yep.
But like still meeting the same customer demand.
Sure. And another example of operations when you really want to get into like leading, regenerative, competitive is we've had clients where they're coating things and it's a powder coat line. And so it needs to have a gas fired oven. And so like you could start by like, how do I make sure that like my gas fired oven is efficient as possible? But we're starting to get clients who are saying, can I get an equal or better coating that doesn't need any thermal energy to adhere, bond, and seal to the product? And so like, that's where you're starting to talk about like, are there new materials, are there new coatings, are there new approaches, and this is where we're seeing also back to like, I think a lot of people when they hear decarbonization just assume this is a loser from a financial standpoint. And it's like, no, if you can create the next generation of technology, materials, approaches, manufacturing, et cetera, like this is actually like competitive in the marketplace, because if you think about it, not only does that coating that doesn't need natural gas reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, it also reduces your costs and it reduces your risk, because natural gas is a volatile commodity. So if you can coat that thing and get a better quality coating, you don't have the risk of buying natural gas every month that could go up or down significantly. You've become more competitive, you've reduced your carbon emissions, you've really started to get to the leading in regenerative end.
Yeah, what I love about this too is how it lines up with this governance piece. Is right, like consolidated, we talk the efficient consolidated approach is we're talking about, like, just make your operations efficient. In the leading standpoint, we're saying like, hey, you're running the oven at this place, and you see that it's 90% of the energy use of your site. Are you empowered to question the use of the oven, or are you just basically saying like, I run my oven as efficient as possible? That's the difference between these two, and that's why governance plays a role in these.
Nice. All right, so let's keep this moving, and we're going to talk about.
Oh, we forgot this part of the operational.
So let me just because I do want to make sure we have time. I should have said this at the top of the hour. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat in the Q&A, and they'll send them over to me, and we'll talk to Danny about them at the end of the webinar. I will say, back in April of 2024, we did a Scope 1, Scope 2 decarbonization webinar. I believe it was Danny, Mitchell, and I. And we cover a lot of this. So if you go back to our website and look at our webinars from the past, you go to our YouTube channel, you can actually watch that. And we cover a ton of this flow chart. So if you have anything,
what I was going to say is like, it wasn't Scope 1 and 2. I think it was literally just called decarbonization, and this is what we talked about. So this is we presented a strategy for how to think about your whole energy portfolio from cradle to grave, and what are some of the options on that.
So yeah, if you're specifically interested in learning about operational decarbonization, that April webinar would be a really good one to check out. All right, so let's jump into the product side, and maybe we can just go right into the following slide now that people have seen this one, and we'll talk about. Tell me just a little bit about like life cycle thinking and how you can make progress on your journey for decarbonization with your product.
Yeah, and I think this is like in each one of these. So in the governance, I think what you're striving for is this empowerment piece, right? It's like how do you facilitate communication in a way that like allows you to adapt and allows you the resiliency at each site, right? Because again, in that instance, and a lot of times what we're talking about is just like the dispersed nature of all of this work, right? Global supply chains, multi-site manufacturing, right? It's and so the governance piece is really like what's the bottleneck, or what we're looking for here is like that quick and immediate communication so that we can adapt and be resilient. In the operations piece, what we were talking about and kind of like what it hinges on is the integration of products into operation decision making, right? And that interplay between the two, and not segmenting them, right? And then we talked about that being life cycle thinking, right? His life cycle thinking is like applying LCAs, like the life cycle analysis at an organizational level, right? So when you are gathering information from your supply chain, are you gathering the type of information that is going to inform your operations and your product design team, right? And so we threw up some of, certifications have a real role in pushing like what it means to,
what good looks like.
Yeah, what good looks like. And these are great for goal setting.
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Because what they give a level of assurance,
and the third party can
trust and move you along that maturity model. And so maybe at different points at the time you say all of our products are going to meet these specific goals, right? We do a lot with the furniture company, and so furniture companies often start with air emissions, right? That the off-gassing of their products meet certain standards, and they move into level certification, which is a multi-attribute certification, and they might move from there into like living product, right? And so this is like the role of certifications. I think ultimately what we start with is like, does my product hurt people, right? So safety requirements, and that's the regulatory, obligatory space, right? And then we have a product and we're like, well, we can make this more efficient, right? And we start to kind of like trim the waste, energy and materials. It's really lean manufacturing, right? It's like, but like that still doesn't doesn't question the materials
There's
that we're
only so
using,
far you
right?
can get, yeah.
And so when you start implementing, more advanced design for the environment, design for sustainability programs, we used to talk about, I know on previous webinars that 70% of the environmental impact of any product or building is embedded at the point, like the first stage of design, right? The first 10% or something like that of the design process. And that's because you have to make certain assumptions
and decisions
decisions at the very start. Well, if you're not considering the environment at that point, you're already
hard to undo all
and so I mean it's as simple as like what, and this we get to this narrative and goal setting piece of this. It's like it's as simple as saying like, what is the environmental story of this product before you even put pen to paper? Like, a customer's going to ask me what the environmental story of this product is. It chemical transparency? Is it recycled content, circular economy? Is it low carbon? What social good, right?
A lot of things.
Embed that at the start, and then that bleeds through, and then that if you have a governance structure that allows you to take into the operations of your supply chain, of your facilities, then you're able to incorporate that in the later stages of the design process, right? So that's going from safety, and then if you do that really well, you get things like the living product, when is actually a regenerative product that's doing the world. We have a client that has really good examples of that. So Oka-Terra is a furniture company we worked with, and they started their design of their products with the idea, asking the question, what if at the end of life of our products we could put it into the forest and it would have it would just decompose, right?
I love that. That's a great question.
And so they had to, source. They spent their time and energy understanding the supply chain and where they could source materials that would meet those requirements. And they have reclaimed urban wood. They have hemp manufacturing, all local type material, no negative chemicals. We know this because we did their Declare label. And so like they're a company that has made a regenerative product. It is possible because they changed the design process. They used life cycle thinking to do that.
Brilliant. I love it. Okay, so now that we have a good handle on governance, operations, and products, let's talk about the strategy that you implemented for this client around stakeholder mapping. So you have this here. Danny, talk to me about what you did for the organization around like looking at where were they at, where were their customers at, where were their competitors at?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the pieces that's useful in this exercise is like we don't assume that everybody wants to just be at regenerative tomorrow.
That's a great point.
Well, the underlying assumption is that the bar is being raised every year, right? And that we can't be laggards in this. But also, we also want to stay and understand where our competitors are or where our clients' competitors are, right? And so we went through an exercise and looked at the goals that other companies had set around their products, around their governance structure, and around their operations. And we were able to map, kind of do a benchmark, right? Yeah. And then you can say like, okay, internally, here's where maybe you are lagging, right, in those three areas. But also, here's where your competitors are lagging or leading, right? And here's where they sit, and here's where you sit. And so then we get it isn't just like, oh, I'm going to set these goals. It's now I've figured out internally what is the most effective place that I can drive resources, and then externally where it's going to actually differentiate me in the marketplace.
Well, I love that example because this client specifically, scored in certain spots, and we showed where their competitors were. And again, the ultimate response on goal setting for them was not for them to get anywhere close to regenerative. Interestingly enough, they said most of our innovation and most of our competitiveness is actually in our products and what we're designing. They happen to be in the medical device space, and so they were really at the cutting edge of that, but they were privately held. So they were actually behind in some of these other areas like governance and operations to the publicly traded peers. And so they basically said, we just want to be equal to the marketplace because we know our products will shine over others. So this is a great time to start to think about where are you strong and where do you want to just stay equal with your competitors, and where are your competitors at? What is the marketplace looking for? So we think this is a really strong model after you understand it to then start to chart, where do you live? Where do your competitors live? Where's the marketplace looking for suppliers to be at, and where do you fit in all of that, and what's your strategy around it? And again, I love this because this is, I think often people just assume the goal is going to be regenerative. Like certainly we hope companies will want to get there eventually, but it won't necessarily mean that's your first goal. And actually, this is a perfect transition into goal setting. So what, Danny, what does an organization need to do to make a good goal? How would you define a good goal?
Yeah, and this, this is like our take, the foresight take, right? And so I think it's useful, but every company
other people have different, every other company, consultants, other organizations have different approaches.
Yeah, I think we have seen companies set 25, 35-year goals, right? That the 2050 is kind of this, right? And to me, that's not a goal, that's a vision, right?
Yep, 100%.
The amount of unknowns between now and 2050 doesn't allow us to put markers in place to adequately show like how we're making progress on this, right? A goal in my mind is at least 5, if not 10 years out, because the next 5 years, to be honest, like you're not going to pivot your organization to substantially change your operations in a way that are going to show up on a goal.
Making 1 or 2 steps on governance or something is going to take 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, imagine happens overnight. Even if you totally reorganized your governance structure, you decided
overhauled your operations,
overhauled all your operations, you electrified every single one of your facilities, and you're selling all new products, you're still not going to get all of that done in 5 years, even if you decided today that that's what was going to happen, right?
Oh yeah.
And so the goals of typically we say 5 to 10 years out, so that we have time to 10 years is a really good timeline because you have time to adapt, and the kind of ups and downs of the marketplace in 10 years kind of levels out. Actionable and clear, you've seen, that's pretty common. It's like, because what you're trying to do, remember, we go back to the beginning of this webinar, you're trying to articulate your strategy, right? And you're trying to say, like, this is how you, customer, stakeholder, know that what I said about who I am as a company means something.
Yep.
Right? And this is it. And
this is the bar I want you to, or this is the measuring stick in which I want you to measure me by.
Right, exactly. I think really, really important, we talked about this, is like the products are what you're judged by.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how cool your sustainability report is. If your product is junk, if it can't be
robot vacuum breaks
right after the warranty, you're going to piss Mike Trupus off, and that's not where you want to be.
Yeah. And then the other piece is this, is like when we talk about operations, we're talking about inclusive of scope 3, because again, I do not care where your boundary is. I care about the embedded carbon that the product has that I'm buying from you as a company.
If you care about the scope 3, Wendy and I last May did a great webinar talking about control versus influence in scope 3 and how to think about scope 3.
One fun part about this too is it allows for more solutions. Perfect. Right? Like if I neglect scope 3, it is 90% of my total emissions in most cases. It also means that's where the most opportunity is for reduction.
Progress.
And so I've really limited myself in just as a matter of principle. You only have so many options for scope 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Right. So
for sure. Okay. So let's talk about key takeaways. Before you get into that, just a reminder, this is the last slide we have. I'm about to grab my phone to read the questions that we have coming in. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to submit them in the Q&A and we'll address them here after the slide. But Danny, if you could just take us through, what are the big takeaways when it comes to setting decarbonization goals?
Yeah. So we have determined why you need a goal. This gets back to that stakeholder piece, right? Is like, who are you setting your goal for? What narrative are you trying to prove?
Sure.
Right? Where are you starting? And this is sometimes because we think of it only in the operational standpoint, we think, well, we have, here's our energy baseline. That's where we're starting. Well, where's your governance structure? Where do your products show up in that? How do you show up in the marketplace to these customers that are demanding, or stakeholders that are demanding, you set a goal to begin with? The 5 to 10 year timeline, right? It's like, really don't send something, if you want it to be meaningful, but you also want to see progress toward it, put it far enough out, but not so far out that, it's meaningless. The boundary piece, huge. Include the scope 3. Just include it.
Yes.
Here's the really secret, like, part of this. People if I said you were 1 million tons or 10 million tons, it is customers and stakeholders don't know what that means. There's
They want to see
no
progress.
Yeah, and it's everybody's setting different boundaries, and so what we really want to understand is like both the progress and like what is encompassed in that,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yep.
that's where we get the baselines, right? How do you
You can't manage what you don't measure.
Thank
My
you.
favorite.
Yeah, and if you don't have a baseline, what do you, then again, you're just naming numbers that you produced last year, and it doesn't mean it doesn't show progress towards anything. And then the decarbonization potential at different levels, I think this gets back to including the scope 3. The decarbonization potential of your scope 3 is way higher than anything you would find in your scope 1, 2s, right?
Yeah.
And so where is the opportunity? And yeah, your level of control or influence is different, but these are all kind of efforts and so I think like companies that have set really effective scope 3 have narrowed it down to specific categories that they know that they have some influence and control on, they have a large impact on, and then are going to impact the like larger story that they're telling us.
Yeah, I love this, and I just want to hammer that home. What was really fun is we wrapped up this project for the client that we built this whole presentation off of. It was so valuable to them that they took the time at the front end to understand where they were at from a maturity standpoint and where they were differentiated from their competitors so that they could set real, achievable, attainable goals and make progress on them. And so I just continue to realize and continue to see when we talk to industrial manufacturers, they don't have a ton of resources sitting around waiting to be deployed on this. They don't have a bunch of people sitting around with nothing to do. And so when you have finite resources, being extremely clear about where you're at and where you're trying to go will really avoid you incinerating resources, doing things that aren't going to really provide all that much value. And so we've really found over the last couple of years, as we've advised our clients, making sure and saying like, why are you really doing this? Is this really going to move the needle for your business? And when I say sustainability from your business, sustainability and the sustainability of our planet, like you have to be really intentional about that right now. It doesn't matter what political climate you're in. It doesn't matter what's going on. The reality is the organizations that are going to be the most studious of the resources that they have are going to be the organizations that win in the 21st century. And so like this is why building a plan like this can be so powerful. All right, so let's jump into some Q&A, shall we, Carolyn? Thanks for sending some questions over. So, all right, I love this, Danny. So the first question, what risks should an organization consider when they're setting their goals?
I mean, I think the first one that comes to mind is the risk of setting the goal on something that you don't need to set the goal on.
Back to what I just said, incinerating resources on something that's not.
I mean, if you're being judged by a product and you have net zero operations and then you sell a product that breaks and has a terrible, carbon story, like what did you spend all that time and energy on, right? Yeah. I think the other piece is, I mean, gets into regulatory and we can't like dive, like I have to be careful and like what different nationalities have around like if you underperform or overperform on your goals, there's risk to that, right? And mostly probably underperforming, right, is like the greenwashing aspect of that, and I think that changes based on the regulation.
I think you summed it up well. I would say the three risks are kind of the stakeholders we talked about at the beginning, which is like laws. So making sure that as you're setting goals, are they complying with the laws that in the jurisdictions with which you operate in? Number two, what are your customers asking you to do? If you're not setting decarbonization goals that align with your customers, you're exposing yourself to a significant amount of business risk, and the fact that you could lose your customers to somebody who's more competitive and who's more aligned. And then the third one you covered is consumer risk, right? Who, if you're more of a consumer-facing brand, just understanding are consumers resonating with what you're doing?
Yeah, I think
the three risks.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The needle you kind of have to thread is like if there are RFPs that literally just say, do you have goals set, right? And that is in order to be considered for this project, you have to set goals. In the same time, there's regulation that says don't set such aggressive goals that you're greenwashing, right? And so you don't want to miss out on the business, but you also don't want to be out of regulation. So
this comes back to, I think, something you've really done a nice job of harping, not only on the webinars, but just in general with our clients, is just be transparent. It's okay, right? Like we understand no organization is perfect. So saying where you're succeeding, where you're failing, where you want to do better, what you're working on. The marketplace isn't looking for perfection. I cannot say that enough. And I know it feels counterintuitive in this like airbrushed social media world, but the reality is I think a lot of people are looking for authenticity. And so to be able to say like, hey, we think we're doing really well in these areas and we're going to double down. But by the way, we actually think we could do better in these areas. And we're trying to invest. People don't get killed for that. People get killed for saying they're the greatest. And then you look under the hood and it's a complete disaster.
Meeting all of our goals and actually they're not, right? And this is actually where you've seen companies, no one has, well, I won't say no one, but companies that have pulled back from SBTI or setting some of these goals, they might have some customer fallout, right, from that. Yeah. But ultimately, they did that so that they could stay aligned with their, like what the reality was playing out for. And so they're not getting burned for resetting, right? You're always allowed to recalculate your baseline, and companies do that. Some companies do that every year, right? And that's because they have divestitures and other things, right? But yeah.
Cool. Okay, the other question we have, again, and if you have any others, this is your last chance to squeeze them in here, is how do you know if a goal is actually attainable? How much can you truly know before you set a goal? I like that. That's a hard question.
I mean, that's the 10-year piece to me. A 25, 35-year goal does not need to be attainable today, right? That is a vision. And that is saying I'm going to shift my operations in order to meet that. I think a 5 to 10-year, you can calculate that. I mean, it is not we were just having this discussion yesterday. We were talking through a decarbonization audit. You can buy your way to net zero. I mean, and I mean that by like I don't mean just in carbon credits, right? I can buy all new heat pumps. I can put solar everywhere. I mean, if you want to invest the money, you can do it, right? But then there are these parameters. As a company, what is your cost parameters for investing in this? That is whether or not you can make it, right? If it is always more profitable for you to, start it, if you're a franchise company and your franchise is always $1 spent over here is more profitable than putting solar on your roof, that's just the reality of your business, right? And so therefore, like, it might not actually be, these goals might never be a priority because that will always be, if that's always your priority.
I would say practically
bouncing speaking, around on that one.
No, I agree. And I would say practically speaking, again, I'm going to just keep harping on this because so much of this framework was built off of this and this client had such a great experience in this project is we deployed engineers to their sites to look at operations. We reviewed a lot of their ISO and other standards to look at governance. We worked to understand products. Certainly didn't do an LCA in this example, but we do LCAs in lifecycle thinking for other organizations. And so what's going to come out of this is that organization can go ahead and say, we're going to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by, I'll make it up, 10 or 15 or 20%. And they can actually know exactly what's possible because our engineers were in the facility. And they can actually also know how much they need to budget to do that. So to your point, like if you're talking 5 or 10 years out, and you have engineers or other smart people that can either look at your, and you wouldn't want engineers necessarily looking at governance unless they're special like Danny. But if you have engineers or other people to look at governance, operations, and product, you really can start to build a roadmap to say, these are the investments we're really going to want to make to get to the next level that we set the goal on. And so here's the resources, either financial or personnel, et cetera, that we need to allocate to make sure that when we go to this, we're going to make progress.
There's a concept called the marginal cost of carbon. We were talking a lot about that this morning, which you can calculate, if your goal is whatever, percent reduction, you can list out all of the opportunities for reducing your emissions, right? And that is both in your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, right? Full supply chain. You can assign like a value for what amount of money you're going to spend in order to reduce, or what it would cost to reduce those emissions, and then you can rank them by the cheapest to the most effective, right? If it's a zero cost operation, and you can reduce it by a ton of emissions, the marginal cost would be essentially zero, right?
Great.
And then so this is different than ROI, right? This is because we're talking about carbon. And so to your point, there is lots of ways to calculate it. It is dependent on the values and financial model of any company and like how they view the investment, right? Is this a purely a cash flow exercise, right? Are we trying to are we still operating in efficiency? If we're just doing efficiency, right, that's a different question than if we're trying to be a differentiator in the marketplace, because we see that there is actually a market for low carbon products, right?
Well said.
So if I'm reducing my cost versus increasing my revenue, the calculation is different, but still something you can calculate.
Well said. Some good food for thought as we wrap up here. We are at the top of the hour. Thank you for listening to Danny and I opine on decarbonization. You are in for a treat for the March webinar. We have some heavy hitters here between Wendy and I talking about successful sustainability disclosure. We're going to talk about EcoVadis, supplier assurance, CDP. It feels like it's that season. Wendy is a deep expert on talking about all of these things, so I will be talking to her about that. And so we'd love for you to join us on March 26th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you again for joining us on the webinar. If you want to talk in more detail about this, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd love to connect. Otherwise, we'll see you next month.